Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on our Fireside Chat series, Get Creative with Cloud-Based Video Workflows. If you're just joining us, please make sure to check our other Fireside Chat sessions as they become available on our YouTube page. Today though, we are talking with Mr. Paul Chapman from SIM International, and of course, Mr. Michael Cioni, who is our SVP of Innovation here at Frame.io. Now, Michael will be facilitating questions to Paul as there is a lot of information that will be shared today, so please sit back, relax, and without further ado, Michael, take it away.
Sean, you are so good at getting these things going. I'm so glad to have you here. You're going to be like my Linus blanket if I need it. Thank you.
Sure, not a problem.
Introduction. And if you guys haven't had a chance, if you all haven't had a chance to check out some of Sean's webinars, his webinars that are weekly at Frame.io are really exceptional. This man knows the cloud, and I recommend that you check it out when you have time to learn a little bit from that master. But today we have another master joining us, the one and only Paul Chapman, here in duotone for the very first time. We have Paul Chapman, who's looking good in the Frame.io color scheme. Welcome so much, Paul. So glad to have you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
This is an exciting day that we've got cooking. I'm the SVP of Innovation at Frame.io. And we're really excited to have everyone here. We want to get to this, but we want, as Sean was pointing out at the beginning, we want to get your questions. So I actually have this cool little device called an iPad. And in that iPad, it's going to send me your questions so that Paul and I can answer them. And Paul can give you exact details on that. We want to keep this, open for everyone, but feel free to challenge us. Paul is much smarter than me, and he can answer some really, really great questions. So feel free to ask the deep leveled stuff. Keep them going, and I'll be keeping an eye on those throughout the chat. Also, Sean and Megan here will be responding to questions as we go. Frame.io is designed for the world's creative and collaborators. We're designed to power the collaborators of the world, and we're growing at a rapid pace. In 5 years, Frame.io has over 1 million users, and we're used all over the world, and we're really excited to be coming to you with some of the latest and greatest technology. But the technology today is not just about Frame.io, it's about integrations. Because a great product cannot just be standing alone on its own. In the past, products were vertically integrated. In the future, products need external integrations. They need to be able to reach and touch everyone else. And that's the master here. Automation is the key. And Paul has got some great quotes to share with us today. Joining us from Sim Video is one of the great masters. And Paul and I have had the pleasure of working together for over a decade, though we've never been at the same company, Paul.
Nearly a year ago, it was nearly.
Nearly. Oh, man, that hurts. But that's true. Backstory, that's a different webinar. We'll do that. Paul, while we're getting kicked off here, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been working on and what makes you tick.
Sure. Well, I joined SIM about 3 years ago, having spent 21 years at Photochem, and that's really where the foundation of some of this work started with the automation, because we were doing some stuff over there to do with encoding and so forth that I was working on that kind of got me into the whole world of how do you join things together. Back in the day of, telecine and all those kinds of things that some of you may know about, we used to join things together with actual wires and connectors and plugs and little pieces of software. And we had a couple of little boxes inside of facilities that I worked in. And one particular one, there was an engineer called Dan, and he used to build these boxes inside the facility. And we literally called them Dan boxes because they glued some of the stuff together. Nowadays, it's much, much easier because you don't have to build anything in metal. You just have to build something in software, which is so much easier. So I've been a software person since the day, since I was a teenager. So I was very, very lucky, and I got to go to school. I was in high school learning computer science. I went to college for that, and then I kind of fell into video for a long time and waited really in a way wasn't really a strategic decision. It's the way it worked out that, computers and video all kind of came together, maybe 20 years ago and things. And so for me, obviously having a computer science background, it was actually a pretty easy transition back into that world. So I began to, dust off those programming skills and other things that I learned, as a teenager and a 20-something-year-old, going fresh out of college. And all of a sudden it's like riding a bike. You never forget that stuff. And I joined SIM about 3 years ago. We're a company that's in North America, 5 sites. We have LA, New York, Atlanta, Vancouver, and Toronto. And we're actually kind of a virtual company in ourselves, in that we have links between the companies over SohoNet and other things like that. So we have the power of that virtual company back behind us. And up on the screen here, you see some of the projects we get involved in. Certainly in Hollywood, we're fairly TV centric, and Sim, as some of you may know, the genesis of Sim was the chainsaw company that was well known in the quick turnaround edit field for many years, doing very demanding projects. So when this pandemic hit, a number of our customers turned to us because they knew that we could quickly turn on things and get things going for them. And so that chainsaw genesis, that chainsaw DNA really helped us out get going very quickly, because a lot of our editors and so forth were very, very used to working in that high pressure environment. And that brought us to now. So.
And it's safe to say everyone watching right now has seen some of your work. There's no question. You can't avoid Paul Chapman, and he may not be a name that you know,
no.
But you can't avoid him because he's got his paws in everything. And one thing you didn't list on your resume is that you're an all-around excellent, nice guy, Paul. Part of that's part of what makes actually our industry function, is when you actually enjoy working together with people.
Yeah.
That's part of the bonus of collaboration, you know.
And one day we'll actually get to see each other again as well.
One day.
One day.
We will. But let's jump into this, because we want to talk a little bit about a specific component. Now, this is a little bit of theory. If you've ever tuned in to a Frame.io Fireside Chat, or you've had conversations with me, I like theories, because theories help us wrap around context. And when you have context, you can apply that to other things. So what Paul and I are going to talk about today mainly centers around one project, but it is applicable based on this theory to your projects. And so we don't want this to be a one and done story. This is something that's meant to help you apply to your world. And Paul uses this word glue. And I really like this word glue. And one of the reasons is, when we look at workflow, a lot of times we look at workflow like this. You see these parts, your camera, your dailies, your DI archive, that stuff. We think of that as workflow. But Paul and I subscribe to the same belief that this actually isn't workflow. In fact, this is sort of like bones. If you think about like a skeleton, your skeleton has bones, and you have all these bones that give you rigidity and give you structure. But ultimately, what allows your skeleton to move are the ligaments. It's the connective tissue. And Paul referred to that as glue. And so the idea is, what actually makes work flow is not the elements that you work with. It's the elements in between those categories. Now, these are just a few examples: Signiant, Colorfront, Frame.io, Yoyada. These are all examples, and there's many different ligaments. But if you realize that if your workflow is limited to just the function of the category, then you might be missing some of the best fluidity, those joints. So this was what Paul was sort of, and I were talking about. Paul, you want to add to this kind of theory as it applies to your life?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, you pretty much covered it. The thing is, you could change the company names out here quite easily, and as long as they have some kind of connector that you can connect one thing to the other, it becomes relatively easy to then make a different workflow that satisfies a different need. Some of the stuff you see here is some of the things that Michael and I worked on together at the HPA this year when we did the Lost Lederhosen project, and the timing of that course was just stunning. In that, a month later we were all locked down, and all of a sudden we have to turn what we kind of were experimenting with into practice.
That's absolutely right. And that kind of is really a great segue, because after Paul and I and Jay-Z, Joachim Zell, and the HPA team, we sort of went through this, I don't know what it was, Paul. It felt like a war, but we went through this experience in which we worked on this remote collaboration, cloud collaboration. And Jay-Z was absolutely the mastermind behind that. And essentially, we had to put into action what we learned doing these experiments. And no longer did we have the ability to experiment. We had to do this practically. So, Paul, tell us a little bit about the project that showed up that you thought might benefit from a version of the Lost Lederhosen.
Well, yeah, this showed up on our doorstep in March. I think it was pretty soon after the lockdown started, and one of our good customers at Sim came to us with this idea. The Global Citizen folks were the people who kicked this off and they wanted to put together this pandemic special that really raised awareness and raised the profile and in the background raised money for trying to help folks out with getting a vaccine going and all this kind of stuff, and just generally helping people out. So the idea was that they wanted to do a live concert, but it was a virtual concert, and they went out and they wanted to reach out to a bunch of celebrities. They had a bunch of other folks, medical professionals and so forth, and the list of politicians and other experts in the field to make a multi-hour special to talk about what was going on and how we can address it and how it's changing the human race.
And here's what I think is the most interesting part. First of all, we have all these international collaborators, because this was all over the world, but possibly the worst part of this assignment was that everything had to happen between March 31st, when Paul called me and got the call himself, and April 18th. What does it feel like? I mean, can you take us back? Remember, stay-at-home orders were like brand new on March 18th.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, I was like you, but I was still working out the details of my home office at that stage as well. We hadn't got all the details in place of how do I get good connectivity and how do I set up my monitors and all those kinds of things. And in the meantime, all of a sudden we're scrambling, trying to get the facility working remote. And then this huge project lands on our doorstep. And really fortunately, because of the HPA experience, I had a lot of background with working with Frame.io. So, it was one of those things where it didn't require too much thought to come to the conclusion, this is the only way to do this project, because I didn't know any other tools out there that could do what I needed it to do.
Well, let's talk about what we did, because as we said, Frame.io is this tool that is moving away from just review and approval. It's expanding, the platform's expanding to encompass other areas of the workflow processes. And so review and approval is one spoke of many spokes in the Frame.io platform. And one of these spokes comes back to this concept of automation. And Paul, you actually, you are a believer in automation. And when you talked about your background in software, a lot of that is designed so that you can make tools work for you, because often a tool can do better than what the manufacturer may have originally intended.
That's right. And I mean, like you said here, this is something that came out of the chat that we were having a few days ago. And really, no one manufacturer these days can fully anticipate what we might need. So I think a lot of the work that we end up doing is customizing the tools to do exactly what we do need. And that's been our philosophy for a while now, because we can't expect somebody to build a one-size-fits-all product anymore. It's just too hard.
Now, that's a good point. And so people listening, this is a really, really big, important component, because if you're using the tools the way the manufacturer intended, what Paul's trying to say here is maybe you're missing out on something else. But we are taught, Paul, I mean, we can't blame people for this, because the fact of the matter is we're taught with these manuals and tutorials and things like that, this is how you use the product. And we have these behaviors, and obviously it's safer to not go outside the lines. How do you recommend to people to start exploring how to, break things in your favor?
Well, the first thing you need to do is you obviously need to understand, the product as it stands, as delivered. But then the first thing I always do is start figuring out what other things you can do with it. Look at the manuals for APIs and all those kinds of things, so that you can really see what you can do to make it, customize it into the form that you want it to.
So you just said a magic word here, which is API. So we're going to have to get into that word. Now, most people know this word, have heard this word, but we want to dig into this a little bit better, a little bit deeper here. So this is where some meat on our bones is going to start coming out. When we're talking about automation, we're talking about manipulation. We're talking about making things work a little bit better for you. So if you could kind of take us through these sort of ideas of yours, Paul, and kind of, let's have a little conversation about
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that, we obviously had to get material out to all the folks who are working on this project in the most efficient way. But the other thing we had to consider was the fact that we clearly knew right at the beginning that we would have very few people on site able to do work that normally humans did, just by having, assistant editors inside the building. And if you remember back in the middle of March, we didn't even know if we were going to be allowed to stay in our building for more than a few more days. They were talking about completely shutting the city down. They were talking about, it's the concept of essential businesses. And, fortunately we were categorized into an essential business, which allowed us to stay working little bit more than we initially anticipated. But we realized that we had to have something that could do as much of that work as possible, without having actual people, in danger, endangering their lives or endangering their health. So what we did was we took a look at the processes we had to implement from the perspective what we needed, and then crafted it into that form that would get the job done. I mean, I think the two things that we'll get into in a little bit are the idea of ingesting material and then delivering it to people. I took a look at the API and figured out those parts, and we'll cover that in a minute. But we need to a lot of the folks that I'm working with, a lot of what we do is we invent little custom pieces of code, and that really helps put glue and join things together in a pretty efficient way.
Yeah, and this third little point right here, identifying a specific problem in need of automation. I'll call out a group of people in our industry that are really good at this. Visual effects supervisors are really good at that, and assistant editors are really good at that, because those are groups of people that have a lot of repetition in the same process that goes over and over and over. Every time there's a new effect shot, every time there's a new pull, every time there's a new revision. And these are a couple of segments of our market in which they identify problems that need automation. When you have a VFX pipeline, for example, or an assistant editorial pipeline where there is no automation, it's very laborious, and it probably slows you down. But not everyone knows about APIs or application programmer interfaces that allow people to automate things. And so, Paul, can you just give us an example of, maybe not one world, give us an example where you will look for opportunities, or people maybe come to you and call you and say, I need to automate this?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned, prior to even being at SIM, was on some of the other work I was doing over at Photocam, was the joining of different tools together. So we had an asset management system, we had an encoding platform, we had a delivery platform. And again, joining those things together with an API-based approach ended up being a very efficient way of doing things. We knew where files were. We had a device called a Strongbox that stores files on tape. I was able to use the API of the Strongbox to find out where files were. I could send it off to an encoder. I could recover them from tape, send them to the encoder, and then deliver them. And it was able to build a complete end-to-end process, all based on just gluing little pieces or gluing different applications together. And actually, it's interesting you brought up the idea of VFX, because that's something we've been working a lot at SIM about, and we didn't even think about this in terms of this presentation, or this chat. But I just wanted to mention that we have a thing called Metabank, and that's doing exactly what you described, which is automating the visual effects pipeline. So that's not the subject for today, but it is something we're very much looking at and implementing as well.
And that's the principle, right? If you take the principle, it applies across. And I think the fifth point right here is really important. This is something that as a former post house owner, I believe in as well. And that's it. Productions and post houses need to invest more in custom code. A lot of times, Paul, companies don't have someone like you on the team. You in some regards are a very rare bird, because you're doing custom code, not to fix things, but to create things, right? You need people to constantly patch, because the submarine's always leaking, but you also need someone to be able to invent stuff. And I think, do you have other people on your team, or how invested is SIM in custom code?
In our group, I'm the one who's doing this part of it. But as I mentioned, we have this other thing that's quite a big project called Metabank, and that has a whole team behind it. I'm not directly involved in that. That's actually mostly being driven out of Canada. Some of you, maybe Jesse's even on this thing, but Jesse Carosi, who's an HPA luminary as well, is very involved in building that product. So that's something that we're definitely investing heavily in as well.
Well, and that's what groups should really strongly, I recommend, get software people onto your facilities and your productions, because you can start leveraging these APIs and automation.
Right.
So now let's shift into the One World project. So now that we've identified some of the theories behind the application, the opportunity, tell us a little bit about the One World special needs.
Well, I think I mentioned before, the need was initially they were going to deliver material. They had to deliver it into a portal. We had to, that's the decentralized part where it came in from around the world. Really, we had to capture and share those assets with the producers and the editors. We wanted to give everybody one place where they could go to upload the material, and we needed to give them a secure platform for reviewing and approving the content that came in so they could begin to build the show. That was the goal at that point. The editorial part of it we worked on in the background. Whilst all this was going on, we were also working out, and again, cast your mind back to March, we were still learning all this stuff. We're still learning in a way, but we've got a much better handle on it now, how to do remote editing properly. Do you use RGS? Do you use Teradici? Do you use something else? Those kind of questions were still very much being evolved at the same time in parallel with this.
And the question of RGS and Teradici and Evercast and Clearview and all the stuff, the answer to that is yes. You need all of those.
You need all of them.
They're all, in a way, their own little bone that you need to ligament connect together as well.
Right. Best of breed really is what you go for.
That's right. Now, we did get a question here that's kind of interesting, Paul. So can you talk a little bit about the process to get the stars footage? See, what's interesting is, now this is what the Guinness Book of World Records didn't recognize this. We'll get to something Guinness in a little bit. But what they didn't recognize is, in the past, we have professionals that shoot celebrities, but the celebrities don't have to shoot themselves, and they certainly don't have to transmit their own material, which is what the API was. So the question was, tell us about the process to get the stars and their footage uploaded into the cloud and into Frame.io, and was it easy for them? And essentially, we started this whole thing with, how do we make this easier, especially since we have celebrities internationally of all technical skill levels, and this is something they have never ever had to do before.
Well, the simple answer is we gave them a pretty easy to use web link that was driven under the hood by Signiant, so that the web link was distributed and they were able to quickly upload to that. Something that, if you remember, you and I tested early on was the idea of actually doing that directly from the iPhone app within Frame.io, and we actually did something I think that maybe you didn't even realize you could do initially with that stage when we were just kicking this thing off. I don't know too many folks who actually used that in the end, but I think it was something that was very much a possibility they could have used if they wanted to.
Yeah, that is one of the things is in Frame.io, because Frame.io is built to be a review and approval at its core with the ability to, upload into it. You can actually shoot a video on your phone. Paul helped me figure this out. This is the test he was talking about. And you shoot a file and you upload directly into Frame.io from your phone photos library where it saves the video asset. The problem is, because Frame.io is a Fort Knox hypersecurity system, you have to have a Frame.io account in order to do that. Yeah. Now that makes sense. You have to be inside the system. You have to be inside Fort Knox to get at the gold. But one of the things that your team brought up and production brought up is we don't want to require everyone to have a Frame.io account in order to get in. So while it would work for some people, in the case of several hundred medical professionals and celebrity singers, that wasn't the ideal approach.
No, so just giving them that simple web link was the simplest thing to do, and it worked pretty well overall. I mean, I think the bigger challenge, honestly, was some of the very basic stuff like, yes, you've got a phone here, you shoot this way, you don't shoot this way. Those are things that that was one of the bigger challenges as well with certain people, and it seems like the bigger their celebrity, the harder it was for them to figure that out.
And I think we can all probably have some empathy for that situation, but it worked. And the reason it worked, I want to point out, is because Paul leveraged a very unique characteristic of Frame.io, which is our at-rest, front-facing, easily accessible API. And an API is essentially just a set of instructions that allows two products that don't have a relationship with each other, to communicate with each other. And so when you have product A with an API and product B with an API, that's what Paul's talking about, becomes those points of glue that you essentially maybe start with duct tape and glue together. Eventually you can make that bulletproof. You eventually sort of said metal, things like that. You can actually get it really robust over time.
Right. So what we're saying here is the RESTful interface. If you can Google it and look it up later, but basically it's a very sort of standardized way of having things give, queries and responses. It's based off of the normal web protocols of HTTP, and it's something that you can actually do just from a regular web browser, and you can experiment with that. But then when you want to get into it from an automation sense, then you want to pick up a programming language, and almost everybody typically uses Python for that. So that's what I did. I used Python with the requests library. I think we're going to probably mention that the fact that Max and Jeff were very supportive on this here. They were they lead your development, your API, your developer relations, I believe. But one of the things I did very early on was go to the online documentation and get the foundation of this worked out in my own head and figure out what I needed to do. And then I went to Jeff and Max to ask some very specific questions about how to do things like authentication and get the responses back in the form that I needed and things. And we kind of worked it through, and we found, interesting, we found a couple little issues that hadn't been anticipated before, and they got fairly quickly resolved. So, it's always interesting when you kind of push things that hard and you find things that haven't been thought of, or maybe little bugs that haven't been discovered so far. So.
And that's absolutely right. And Jeff and Max are a perfect example of an incredibly talented individuals that Frame.io uses to help connect with people that want API integrations. And so when you're going through the integration, there are humans to talk to. So it's not just you. Even Paul, an expert like Paul, could leverage having some support through some of our team. Plus, Paul's work then gets captured by the Frame.io integrations team so that Max and Jeff can pass that into engineering. So eventually this can become easier and better and more robust for other users down the line. In other words, sometimes the best trailblazers, Paul being a strong trailblazer, you will go through and hack your way through with a machete, but the person behind you no longer needs to do that. And that's important in our product.
That's that thing about, the people up front have the arrows in their back, right?
They always do.
Yeah.
And so this is actually a little picture. If you go to developer.frame.io, this is where you can click on the button See Docs, and you can actually see all the different areas of how the API can integrate and different functions and opportunities, because not everybody will have the same need for integrations as Paul did. But if you start thinking that fourth bullet several slides ago, what is a task that needs to be automated better? What am I doing every day over and over? What is redundant? What is annoying? Or what is even utilitarian, a process that isn't really creative? It is likely that the right API integration between a product like Frame.io and your tool might make that process automatic so you can be focusing on other things. And we publish this with a lot of helpful hints in here. And then people like Max and Jeff can help take it to the next step.
Yeah, I mean, some of the code examples on there are pretty much, you can take them, and if you know a little bit of this stuff, you can take those examples and turn them into working items very quickly.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the next thing here is essentially, what was your custom action physically doing? And first tell us how you came up with this. We talked a little bit about, we have a celebrity upload problem. Yeah. And then you take us through what the solution was.
Well, I think, I mean, the challenge was we needed to have the one portal, the one place that people could upload to easily. Sim was already pretty heavily invested in Signient, so, we didn't have to go out and learn something new. That was something that other members of the team could set up. Jesse and Peyton and folks that you may have come across through HPA connections. They're both well-known Sim employees who know that stuff inside out and backwards. So I didn't have to, learn that stuff as well. So they got the AP, the Signient URL worked out. I did discover a couple of interesting things about Signient and how it worked, which actually I was able to leverage in terms of things like, they had the transfer ID built into a directory, so I could use that to do some testing later on. I was able to also talk to the Signient API. One of the tricks there is to determine when a Signient transfer is completed, because you don't want to be sort of moving files in the middle of a transfer. So there's a bit of work in there just to test to make sure that the transfer is complete. Once it is complete, then the package is uploaded to Frame.io. It was chosen that way just because we figured that the people wanted to see it first, and then we move it over to our editorial storage, which is Nexus, Avid storage in this case. And then that gets moved to the other side of the firewall, essentially, so that it's maintained in a secure environment for people to start editing with. So we have to use this to cross that bridge between the wild world of the internet into the production storage. And that's something we also are very careful about because of our security inside the facility. So this allowed us to maintain that secure environment as well.
And essentially, we're looking at this in just several bullets here, but what was the time it took you in time investment in order to achieve this package?
I think we pretty much got it working inside of a week. Yeah, I mean, the first part of it was fairly straightforward. There was a little bit of fine tuning and things, and discovering some of the ways that Cioni delivers files and what happens when a file delivery stalls halfway through, those kinds of things. It's always those edge cases that you have to look for. It's a pretty well-known term in the software development environment. You actually get the main body of the code working very quickly, and the rest of the development time is fixing and nailing all those little edge cases and getting them all sorted out and working properly. And that's very much what I was dealing with. I would say it probably took 2 or 3 iterations to get to that point where everything was pretty stable. It required a little bit of hand-holding at the beginning, for sure.
Sure. And I can't remember if we discussed this before, Paul, but do you know of anyone who was unable to get their material into the pipeline here?
No, I think the only challenge we had really was some of the larger packages that people tried to deliver with bad internet, and I think that kind of segues into some other things we're going to talk about. But certainly those are the bigger challenges. Is just if you have poor internet connections and things like that. That was really where deliveries might have got stalled.
Well, then let's take a step back, because people are sending some questions about
Sure.
The actual end-to-end now. Because now if you imagine we have this API working in this third little slot here, let's take people through what actually One World did.
Okay. So obviously the recording, One World was pretty much all user-generated content. It was all generated on iPhones or Android phones. Lot of people recording stuff for the first time. They've never really done that kind of thing before. The upload, as I said, was done onto the Cioni portal, and then we did the Frame.io import. So that we've pretty much covered those parts of it. Once the files were copied onto the Nexus, and I noticed a little spelling in there. I missed that before. Editors, they were cutting on Avid with the typical normal Avid techniques, using the HPRGS remoting system that a lot of people have started to use. That's one of the 2 main systems that are out there, that and Teradici. And then once cuts were made, we were using Evercast to stream the cuts out to people who are also working remotely, so they could do review and approval in real time of the editing process. So that's very much like the over-the-shoulder approach to editing, where imagine a room where you've got 5 or 6 people all contributing thoughts on how the cut should go. So in this case, you would have 5 or 6 Evercast users, maybe even more, watching what the editor's doing and making suggestions. And then the second stage of that was once they got to that cut to the point where everybody pretty much agreed with what was good to go, then they would export it out of Avid back into Frame.io, where it could be distributed to a larger group for an overall approval process. And of course, you have the commenting capability within Frame.io, so that people could add comments and make suggestions and stuff at that point. Then once we moved into the online environment, we did a very similar process, except we went to the SohoNet system, the Clearview Flex, which was maybe a slightly higher quality video experience for watching over the online and color correction part of it, so that we could have people sit at home again and review what was going on in the online edit, and also light color correction that went on as well.
And so we have a great question here from Jeff to tie into what you just went over. And the question is, you mentioned the request libraries to speak with the API.
Yes.
Was there a function missing in the Frame.io Python client that forced you to work directly with the REST API rather than with the Python wrap?
Yeah, I think there was a few. I don't remember the specific things, but I did experiment with both the sort of Python library that's provided and also just using requests. And I ended up using a hybrid of the two. Quite honestly, I honestly don't remember the specific items that were missing from that, but I'm sure they could be figured out. But the good news is, if it didn't exist inside of the Frame.io Python library that you install, then it was pretty easy to install requests and just use it directly and get what you needed out of it.
Yeah, and that's the type of feedback that, because our team is invested in this and working with you, we then take that feedback and
Yeah.
update the library so that the next person is able to leverage it.
Yeah, yeah.
Sven asks a great question here. He's asking about how much of One World was pre-produced versus live. I don't think there were no live elements at the end of the day, were there?
Nothing was actually live. No, everything was produced essentially prior, in the hours leading up to the point at which it was distributed. I think aired is the wrong term these days, but distributed is probably the right term. Nothing was actually really live, but I think the live is the fact that people were live to their phones and live to other events, live to other capture devices.
And when the editors are using RGS to get back to the facility, and you said it's behind a firewall, is that a VPN network, or how are they actually doing that communication?
It's essentially, it's not a VPN. There's a broker involved between the two, so that we have a very small hole available inside the firewall that's controlled through another application that's a broker application, so that we don't have to punch. Because at one point I counted up, we have this broker software that we use. Has a licensing capability, and at one point we actually busted through that license, and we were over 50 remote stations all running at the same time, and we had to do a quick update on that to get the additional licenses we need. But if you imagine just doing a VPN, you'd have to have 50 holes punched in your firewall, one for every VPN, and that quickly becomes untenable.
Yeah, and far less. Yeah, that's removing all this automation you did, and you replaced it with manual work. So
yeah, exactly.
You don't want that.
Yeah.
Now, one thing you touched on several minutes ago that can be really handy here is this. We're living in an internet reliable age, but no longer is it a need to have or a nice to have. It's now an absolute need to have. And we talk about the quality of the internet because, not all internet is the same. And a lot of people may feel that they don't have enough internet to do any of these professional integrations. And I found that not to be true. Most people are pretty self-sufficient and working successfully at home with some caveats.
Yeah.
What is your opinion on what is good enough for a professional home internet experience?
Well, I think what the number one thing is, if you're doing anything like RGS editing, you really need the hard line, the cable. Wi-Fi is not sufficient. Now, I happen to be doing this call over a Wi-Fi connection. As you can see, I'm outside. I'm only 10 feet from my router. It's a pretty new router. I made sure I have one that has 5G on it. So I benchmarked that and found that I was pretty much getting the same speeds over that Wi-Fi as I get off my hardline connection. So I felt pretty confident it would work for this kind of thing. But in general terms, we recommend a hardline, the Cat 6 or Cat 5 cable. Really you have to do that, because what happens is, interference may happen to the wireless signal inside your home. Somebody might walk between you and the router, something else might happen, and all of a sudden your editing starts stuttering. So that's what gives you that solid connection. We sometimes experience packet loss between the remote site and the where we are inside of in Hollywood. Actually, on the Flex application, SohoNet, one of the things they do is they actually measure the packet loss all the way to the home viewer, and they can see sometimes when the home viewer is experiencing packet loss, and that's typically going to happen maybe somewhere inside of the internet provider's network. Maybe there's an edge router somewhere out in the suburbs that's saturated and it's dropping packets. So packet loss really is just this, when an internet device can't cope, it just basically stops transmitting and it just drops the packets, and they have to be retransmitted, and that's what slowed things down. And that's what we experience sometimes. We did have one particular customer who was having a lot of trouble with their network and their office as well, and we had to work with them to try and get things tuned up a bit.
And tuning that up can be actually as simple as getting a better router. A lot of times, many of us are working with what our cable provider gives us for free, but that's not always the best
No,
device on the market.
I went through this exercise after, maybe in April, I think it was, and we were still pretty locked down by then, and I realized that my router at home was pretty old, so I researched it, and I could have got a free one from Spectrum, but I decided to go out and spend $100 on a one that I did a bit of research on, got it from Best Buy. It's that thing about the plumber's house has leaky taps, and in this case, somebody like me, sometimes their network at home is not always the best because I spend all my time at work. I used to spend all my time at work, and I'm used to a good network there. I get home and I don't really do much with it now. Of course, it's very different. So I did upgrade both my main internet router and also one of my Wi-Fi devices as well recently.
And that's a good point, because the hardline, a lot of us rely so much on wireless because it's mostly so stable and it's always there that we just get used to it as always working. And we've kind of weaned ourselves off of having to plug in cables. But remember, you still go to hotels, and the thing, you put your bag down and you see the hotel has an Ethernet cable still because it's so old. But ironically, that's where the performance is. Everyone wants to log into the hotel Wi-Fi. That's what will burn you. The Ethernet was probably significantly better.
Yep.
It's kind of funny how that happens. And we want to point out that Frame.io actually recently released a new product called Transfer, which is a tool that allows you to get closer, faster, more easily configurable and monitored transfers to and from Frame.io to your local storage. So people that are engaged in hybrid workflows, not the RGS. The RGS that Paul was talking about is a full cloud-to-cloud experience. But when you need localizing of assets, for whatever reason that may be, Frame.io Transfer is now sort of a beautiful experience with a terminal quality. So you can, it's like logging in with a beautiful UI that Thomas Szabo has really spearheaded at Frame.io and done an exceptional job of making a robust transfer, even when you have unreliable internet. It will maintain and monitor packet loss. It will monitor dropouts, and it will essentially allow you to close your laptop and restart it, and then open your laptop, and it will pick up where the file left off and keep it going. So you don't have to restart those transfers when you're at 98% done and you lose it, which is the worst feeling in the world. Frame.io Transfer will pick you up and give you that last 2% regardless of the status of your network connection. So that's another pro tip. So as we're rounding the bases, Paul, we have something to show about this because it's a result. We actually did all this work. You carried the lion's share. Sim and its empire of editors and your over-the-shoulder solutions with SohoNet, Clearview Flex, and so on. We have something to show for it, which is the result of the One World concert. This is a picture of the Frame.io project. This is a real picture of Frame.io where, which you can see some of the people that contributed and uploaded their own file. Oscar the Grouch is on here, for goodness sakes, you know, like everybody's in here. And so when you got to see this at home, this is sort of what it looked like at home. And myself and my family, we tuned in to watching the concert, and this was an incredible experience. Paul, tell us a little bit, what did it feel like when this thing actually, they pushed the button and this thing started working?
It felt pretty good, I have to tell you, although obviously there's some good nail-biting experiences towards the very end. I was monitoring from home the playout that we had a live playout of video, and we also had an internet delivery on this. And I think that if I remember rightly, the playout happened at in the wee hours of a Saturday morning or Sunday morning, Saturday night, and we have a connection to a thing called the LA Switch, which is a video routing system. And they were literally playing from good old school videotape at one point, and they even sent it out. They sent it out to the BBC, and the BBC actually had a little thing where they had to do a redo on something because of a logo positioning issue. So that got delayed slightly. But I was watching all this stuff on email throughout the night. I had my phone right by the bed, and I'd sort of probably wake up at some point, wonder how it was going. So it was an interesting weekend, that final weekend when we delivered, for sure.
Well, here is some of the really incredible milestones that were executed because of this gargantuan effort. First of all, it was a 6-hour playlist, which is an unbelievable amount of content that was captured, and then just played back. The donations, like the purpose of this obviously wasn't to make exercise APIs. That's not why One World was made.
Right.
OneWorld was made to raise money to help the COVID crisis, especially in the earliest stages. And 127 million were raised really, really quickly. That number came from only a few days directly.
Yeah, that was actually prior to the actual airing of it. The event really celebrated this fact, that it wasn't really a telethon in the sense of raising money, but it was a process that raised that money ahead of time.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Guinness Book of World Records came out, and they realized, and they've been awarded, the OneWorld group has been awarded that this was the most musical acts performed in one show. And that's
amazing.
That's pretty cool. And then over 270 million people actually saw this, and there was actually a shorter version as well. So there's the 6 hour.
It was two-hour broadcast version, and then the 6-hour internet web version.
And remember, all of this was done with a whole bunch of collaboration. So this is a great picture of the collaboration done inside of Frame.io. So the Frame.io integration with the production, the producers, the editors, and many of the artists and their assistants and their labels had over 6,400 views in Frame.io, 3,500, over 3,600 assets uploaded, almost 300 independent links distributed. And remember, this was all done between March 31st and April 18th. So this, if you think about averaging, 19 days of work and getting thousands and thousands of things happening, you and your team were a machine. And Frame.io became this centralized hub that was just sort of like an air traffic controller at the busiest airport in the galaxy. That's kind of what happened here.
I think we were probably the busiest post house in the galaxy at that stage, for sure.
And there's no question. And Sim has continued to be
Yeah.
very busy because of this. But I think perhaps the most exciting part of this is once this was proven to work, people noticed what you did, Paul. They noticed what Sim delivered, and then you started getting calls for other projects.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing was that we quickly were able to help show that this is a practical way of making these media events in a very quick turnaround way. So these are some of the events that we worked on. There's a few that are not listed on here because they're probably lower profile that people may not have known about. But these are the main ones that we then did after that. You've got things like the John Legend special, which was fairly late in the process. Where what happened was over time, as these shows came through, we evolved the process. The process itself evolved in that there was less true user-generated content shot, less iPhone footage, more. They started sending out camera packages and things to people's houses, so we actually started to get real good professional-looking video coming in. And then also the process evolved as well over time as well, and so we got it pretty fine-tuned. And it got to a stage towards the end of this cycle where I was able to onboard a show within 1 to 2 hours, of getting the word that we had another show coming in. So it was became a very slick process in the end. But I think the main thing is what we're seeing now is people are moving back towards using professional cameras on these events. And so we're having to approach things in a slightly different way now because we're getting much larger chunks of data coming in again.
That's a good point, because Oscar actually asks, were the H.264 files from the phone directly used for editing, or did you transcode them to different formats? Because obviously higher bitrate codecs would slow down editing over the internet.
Yeah, typically, if it's an iPhone footage, they do typically transcode to a more Avid-friendly format. But yeah, I mean, it depends on your editing platform, how well it handles that footage. Sure, of course, you could use the footage directly as it came across from the iPhone, but you might want to put it into a form that your edit platform likes better and doesn't choke over, because sometimes they do choke on these things.
And Oscar, to be clear about what Paul just said, I want to also add to that it's not actually the codec type for the internet consideration. It's the codec type for the NLE's consideration. Because when you use a system like RGS, you could have uncompressed material in there. It could be the biggest material in the world. That's still going to transmit to your home in low bandwidth situations fine. Because the processing's in the cloud, and it's going to essentially make, in a way, a new video that's delivered to you in video form so you can see it. So if you're editing with iPhone H.264 or HEVC or HEIC material, or you're editing with uncompressed or EXR or ARRI RAW or R3D, Once it's in the cloud, getting that down to your system, if you're doing an RGS type system, or even like a SohoNet Clearview system, that's not going to really matter because the packet is going to be sort of re-enveloped when it's transmitted to the other end. Paul, you used the term over-the-shoulder services once, and I kind of like that idea. Frame.io is an asynchronous review tool where you're outputting and making review notes, and those send back to the creatives. But a system like SohoNet is an over-the-shoulder synchronous review. You want to just touch on that, the difference there?
Well, I think the difference is it's just like, are you sitting in the room watching the editor work, and are you watching the monitor, the main monitor in his room? That's what you're getting when you're doing Evercast or Flex, the Clearview Flex. Or are you sitting at home and he sent you a file to watch on some computer, and that's when the Frame.io, that's what we're talking about with Frame.io, because you're sitting down at a computer, you're logging into a web browser, and then you're able to, manipulate the file just like you want to. You can scrub around, you can make comments, things that you can't do in an edit bay when the editor's driving the file.
That's right. So as we get to the final section here, our wish list, you pointed out some ideas that you have going forward. And one of them was the dealing with metadata, because the camera technology is changing in this. Why don't you take us through a few of these items?
Well, one of the things that we found for sure is that, as we started to upload it, the entire camera package as delivered to us on a memory card or on a hard drive, there's a lot of superfluous files that show up on that card that you don't necessarily want to show to or expose to the viewer because they don't mean anything. But by the same token, they could be something that would allow Frame.io or some other review and approval system to better interpret the camera footage. I mean, it could be as simple as knowing that it's in log space versus 709. Or it could be, some lookup tables used during the viewing environment. So I think as this thing evolves, we'll probably see more, use of those metadata that shows up in the dailies process, and then steering that color management that comes in from the camera and taking the best advantage of it. Also, we discovered that there's some things that are, I know, on the roadmap for better mass upload and download using the API of material. So I know that's coming. I'm looking forward to using that. And obviously, as things integrate better with different applications, that's always good to hear about. The Avid is probably not one of the more integrated solutions right now, where I know you are integrated well with Adobe, for example. So maybe one day that'll happen.
And that's what we're looking for, more integrations and the openness of it. We need the future of workflow is in the ligaments. It's in the fluidity, and people want integrations. People don't want to be told what instrument to play. You want to play whatever instrument you want, but you want those all be playing the same notes, right? Yeah. And so these integrations ensure that becomes possible. And I also want to point out about robust camera packages, because camera packages, some groups are figuring out how to make remote camera packages and what that means, not just cleanliness, but also remote capabilities. There's a lot of cinematographers and entrepreneurs that are starting to build remote camera capabilities where they can do remote follow focus from home and remote heads from home, and they're logging in and controlling their tools from home. And no one ever needed that before, but when the plumbing is there, now the opportunity for APIs allows you to leverage those new ideas. So there was a couple more questions. We want you to know that you can learn more at frame.io.demo. There's a lot there to learn. But before we go, there was a couple more fun questions that I wanted to touch. Well, the first one here is, well, what is the compression rate? Rico asked, what's the compression per transfer rate? I think we have to try to interpret what Rico's saying there. Let me read it one more time, Paul. What is the compression per transfer rate?
I don't really understand that question, quite honestly, because I mean, we transfer to Frame.io the raw assets, however they came in, and I know that you have a transcode process that happens inside of the cloud that transfers them into the H.264 for viewing, but I don't know beyond that how to answer that question.
I would say, Rico, if we take a guess here at what you're also getting at, it's that when you upload a native file into Frame.io, we keep the native file. We don't destroy it. We don't remove it. We don't manipulate it. But we create several options for lower bandwidth performance. But if you ever want to get the high performance, the original media, you're allowed to download that. You can force it to give you that asset. So you always have Frame.io as a transfer medium of your hero asset. And then it can also be streamed in poorer network connections. And then we make 3 to 4 different versions that will knock the quality down. And so so they almost are like half of each other, half.
I did actually test the whole idea of uploading an asset and downloading it, and I did a checksum comparison. They were identical. So
good to hear.
Yeah.
And then this is a good one from Drew. Drew asks, what was your feeling about the Rolling Stones sync?
I thought it was a typical Rolling Stones moment, quite honestly. I think with Charlie playing the drums there and his air drums and didn't actually have any real drums, it was just, quite amusing. Some of that, I mean, I will say, some of those packages did come to us pre-done. Some of the artists are quite sophisticated as to having their own video and audio studios and things, and there were some items in that were pre-packaged, and I'm not going to tell you which ones they were because I don't know what I'm allowed to say, but you can probably form your own conclusions.
Yeah, that's a healthy, safe answer there, Paul.
Yeah,
but in defense of the Rolling Stones, this is this was never been done before. So it's possible that as people were asked to do this thing, different people interpreted what the assignment actually was.
Right, yeah.
There was no reference for what was happening here.
The one I particularly liked, actually, I think was the Keith Urban one where he was, on shot, in the 3 different versions of him in that same shot. And that was particularly well done. I will actually say that Bill Durandi, who's our head of post at Sim and is also still very much an active editor, his hobby is drumming. So he's got that rhythm down for sure. So
very good. Yes. And a shout out to Bill for
the team. Yeah. Mike Polito is the other one who was really involved in this thing as well. So
excellent. And Bill was instrumental in helping Frame.io be part of this story as well. And so we're very thankful to Bill and for doing
just
that.
One other person just to mention is Crystal, our operations person, who put in like more hours in the day than actually exist, I think, at times. So
and isn't that's how these things go?
Yeah, I think they manufacture hours sometimes to get these jobs done.
And and same on everybody's team, everyone watching, what it's like to be surrounded by a team. Making a production is always a team effort. And when you have a production with complexity and newness of something like this, it is truly an incredible experience. Last question, Paul, do you know about how many terabytes, this is from Romero, do you know how many terabytes of total footage ended up being shot versus how much you ended up storing on your Nexus and then the deliverable?
No, I don't. Well, I think it was about 8 terabytes of Frame.io for that project. That somebody maybe from the Frame.io side could quickly take a quick. You still have access to the project is still online, but in terms of Nexus, I mean, obviously it's going to be all that material plus everything that gets made in online and offline and online. So when you might start off with 8 terabytes of source material, that very quickly blooms out to a lot more than that once you start doing renders and things. So you're probably sort of 30 plus terabytes when you're done on a project. It's
absolutely true. It's like things have a tendency to grow, don't they, Paul?
Oh yeah. And they also tend to stick around longer than they should as well. So
they sure do. Data is like a tree. It starts in a seed you can put in the palm of your hand, and then the thing grows and it never goes away. So long lifespan. And that's an excellent way to kind of wrap this up. Is that this is a story that is scalable. And it's something that can last a long time. And we're looking for opportunities. Frame.io loves to be challenged by people. Paul, you are an exceptional friend and customer because you're pushing the boundaries in your camp, and that forces you to push boundaries on our camp. And we actually invite that. For those of you watching that haven't tested Frame.io, go visit frame.io/demo, test it out, but challenge us because we're looking for people that are avant-garde. Frame.io was born out of challenging the status quo, trying something that hasn't been done before, and trying to invent and improve in an area that is severely lacking of certain infrastructure. And Paul, you're doing the same thing with your group, and that's why this wasn't a one world, one and done story. This is now scaling. You said the slide doesn't even include all the people leveraging this.
No, and there's more to come as well. It's an evolving situation. I just wanted to tell a brief, add on to that about, test material is the fact that I have a particular friend who works in the media and entertainment business who's told various manufacturers and vendors to be very careful about what they give me, because I will almost certainly break it in some way when it comes to me. So, and I do say I did actually manage to break your API a couple of times, but the guys responded very quickly. So
that's fine. Don't be
Yeah.
ashamed of
Yeah.
that. You're
Yeah.
forging new ground. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Paul, for joining us today, sharing your
Thank
story,
you.
your expertise.
Yeah.
You're an exceptional human being with an
Thank you.
exceptional skill. And thank you, everyone, for watching and tuning in. Please send your questions. And you can always reach out to us. We're here to help, and we're excited to see how our API can actually benefit your world as well. Thanks to Sean and Megan and the marketing team for putting this together. And thank you, everybody, for the success. Sean, you are a gentleman, and thanks for letting us join in this webinar. Goodbye, everybody.